The year was 1875, and Utah's mountains stood tall and watchful, like ancient guardians. Winter had painted the peaks white, and even in spring, streaks of snow clung to the highest points, glittering under the wide, pale sky. This was a land of quiet majesty, where the wind sang old songs through pine trees and the rivers tumbled over smooth stones, always hurrying to somewhere else. Deep within these towering ranges, far from the small, dusty towns that dotted the valleys, lived a man known only as the Hermit. His home was a small cabin, nestled in a sheltered hollow, almost hidden by thick groves of aspen and fir. Smoke curled lazily from its stone chimney, a thin gray ribbon against the endless blue. Life here was simple, ruled by the sun's path and the changing seasons. The air smelled of pine needles, damp earth, and, faintly, of wood smoke. The hermit himself was as much a part of the landscape as the sturdy oaks outside his door. His face was weathered by sun and wind, his hands strong and calloused from years of work. He spoke little, for there was rarely anyone to speak to, and the mountains themselves offered no chatter. His days were spent in a rhythm of quiet tasks, gathering firewood, hunting small game, and most importantly, carving. His carvings were not trinkets or toys. They were solemn, beautiful things, shaped from sturdy cedar and smooth pine. Hearts. Each one was carefully crafted, its curves gentle, its surface polished until it gleamed. These wooden hearts were grave markers, simple tributes for those laid to rest in the rough earth of the frontier. Sometimes a lone traveler would make the difficult journey up the winding paths to his cabin, seeking a heart for a departed loved one. They would leave a few coins or a sack of flour, and the hermit would hand over a freshly carved piece, sometimes not exchanging a single word. His cabin was small but tidy, filled with the sweet scent of wood shavings. Tools hung neatly on the walls, chisels, gouges, files, all well used and cared for. A small fire crackled in the hearth, chasing away the mountain chill. Outside, the vastness of Utah stretched on, silent and breathtaking, a mirror to the quiet life he lived within it. He was a man apart, connected to the earth, but seemingly disconnected from the bustling, complicated world of people. The hermit's life was a tapestry woven with silence and wood. Each sunrise brought the same quiet routine. He would wake with the first gray light, stir the embers in the hearth, and prepare a simple meal of dried meat and cornmeal mush. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the distant call of a hawk, or the soft rustle of wind through the pines. He rarely thought about the world beyond his mountain, finding enough company in the trees and the patient grains of wood. His true calling, the heart of his existence, lay in the careful crafting of wooden hearts. These are not quick carvings. Each piece began as a rough block of cedar or pine, what he had personally chosen and cut from the forest. He knew the character of each tree, the way its fibers ran, the stories held within its rings. With skilled hands, he would first sketch the shape, a perfect, comforting curve onto the raw timber. Then, the chisels would begin their dance. He worked slowly, deliberately, each stroke removing just enough wood, never too much. His movements were fluid, practiced over countless hours. The shavings curled away, soft and fragrant, falling like tiny golden ribbons onto the dirt floor. He paid attention to every detail, ensuring the edges were smooth, the surfaces flawless. He could spend an entire day, sometimes two, on a single heart. It wasn't just about making an object, it was about pouring a piece of himself, a silent prayer, into the wood. The purpose of these hearts was solemn and clear. They marked graves. In a land where stone was scarce and costly, a beautifully carved wooden heart was a fitting tribute. It spoke of enduring love, even in loss, a quiet testament to a life lived. The hermit understood this. He never asked about the person who had died, nor did he offer words of comfort. His comfort was in the craft itself, in creating something beautiful and lasting out of sorrow. He believed the care he put into each heart honored the memory it would represent. His small workshop, a corner of his cabin, was always neat. The tools were sharp, the wood stacked, the finished hearts lined up on a shelf, waiting. They ranged in size, some small enough for a child's grave, others large and grand for an adult. Each one was unique, yet all shared the same gentle, timeless shape. His work was not for money, not for fame, but for a deep, unspoken purpose that only he, and perhaps the mountain itself, truly understood. It was a life of quiet purpose, carved into wood piece by painstaking piece. One late afternoon, as the sun began its slow dip behind the western ridges, casting long shadows across the valley, a new presence stirred the quiet air around the hermit's cabin. It was not the familiar sound of a deer or the rustle of a badger. This was the steady, rhythmic crunch of boots on the rocky path, accompanied by the occasional sigh of a person growing weary. Soon, a figure emerged from a tree-line. She was a tall woman, unusually so for the time, with a straight back and a determined stride. Her name was Martha. Her face, framed by a practical bonnet, was strong and serious, marked by lines that spoke more of quiet thought than of laughter. She carried a worn leather satchel, not heavy, but clutched with a firm hand. Martha was what people in the valley called a spinster, a woman who had lived many seasons without taking a husband, and who had learned to rely entirely on her own strength. Martha had traveled a long way, leaving behind the small settlement where she had lived her entire life. News of the hermit and his unique wooden hearts had reached even her secluded community, whispered from one traveler to the next. She had heard how his carvings brought a special comfort to graves otherwise marked by simple stones or plain wood. And comfort was precisely what Martha sought. Her journey had been difficult. The mountain paths were steep and unforgiving, and the air grew thin as she climbed. But Martha's resolve was stronger than any physical hardship. She carried a sorrow in her own heart, a grief for a loved one recently lost, and a longing to give them a marker that truly honored their memory. A plain stone would not do. She pictured a heart, warm and enduring, just like the love she felt. As she stepped into the small clearing before the hermit's cabin, she paused, taking in the scene. The cabin was humble, yet there was a deep sense of order about it, a quiet strength that matched the man rumored to live there. A faint scent of wood smoke and fresh-cut pine filled the air. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. She had come for a wooden heart, and she would not leave until she had one. The image of the hermit, a man as solitary as she, was about to meet the unwavering will of Martha. Martha stood before the cabin, her breath still catching from a climb. The door, made of rough-hewn planks, was ajar. She pushed it open slowly, revealing a dimly lit room that smelled of cedar on something else, something old and still. The hermit was seated at a rough-hewn table, a half-carved block of wood in his hands. He looked up, his eyes, the color of deep forest moss, meeting hers without surprise, but with a guarded stillness. He was a man carved from the mountains themselves, tall, lean, and quiet. His beard was grizzled, his hair long and streaked with gray. He wore simple, worn clothes that blended with the cabin's muted tones. He didn't speak, merely watched her, his expression unreadable. Martha, accustomed to directness, broke the silence. "I've come for a heart," she stated, her voice steady despite the weariness in her bones. "A wooden one, for grave marker." The hermit nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to the shelf where finished hearts rested. He rose without a sound, his movements fluid despite his age. He was taller than she expected, almost as tall as she was, which was rare. He walked to the shelf and picked up a heart, turning it in his hands. It was smooth, perfectly shaped, and glowed with the warm richness of polished wood. He held it out to her. Martha took the heart, feeling its weight and smoothness. It was even more beautiful than she had imagined. As her fingers closed around the wood, her eyes, sharp and seeing, swept over the hermit. She noticed the way his shoulders were slightly slumped, not from weakness, but from a lifetime of carrying only his own burdens. She saw the fine lines around his eyes that spoke not of laughter, but of countless sunrises and sunsets witnessed alone. There is a profound silence about him, not just in his lack of words, but in his very being, It was then that a deep ache settled in Martha's own heart, not just for her lost loved one, but for this man. She saw past his skill, past his solitude, to the raw, exposed core of his loneliness. It was a loneliness so deep, so absolute, it seemed to cling to him like the scent of pine. It was a loneliness that resonated with a part of herself she rarely acknowledged. She saw that he didn't just live alone, he was truly, utterly alone. A sudden, powerful thought took root in her mind, unbidden and firm. She couldn't simply take the heart and leave him to this vast, empty quiet. Not now that she had seen it so clearly. Holding the smooth, comforting weight of the wooden heart, Martha felt a shift inside her. The need to leave, to return to her own quiet life, faded. Instead, a new, strong feeling took its place, a stubborn certainty that she would not, abandon this man to his desolate solitude. The hermit watched her, his expression still unreadable, waiting for her to offer payment or to simply depart. He probably expected her to turn and go, like all the others. But Martha did not move. "I will stay," she said, her voice soft but firm, a statement rather than a question. The hermit blinked, a slow, almost imperceptible movement. His brow furrowed slightly, the first hint of surprise on his face. He said nothing, but his eyes, for a fleeting moment, held a flicker of something like confusion, or perhaps alarm. "I can help," Martha continued, gesturing vaguely around the small cabin. "With the chores. With gathering wood. I can cook." She knew her skills were practical and useful, even in this remote place. He finally found his voice, a low rumble, rough from disuse. "No, I live alone." His words were few, but his meaning was clear. He was not asking for company. "I see that," Martha replied, her gaze steady. "And I see it's not good for you." She stepped further into the room, placing the carved heart gently on the table. "You don't have to be alone." He shook his head, a small, quick motion. "I always have been." It was a simple truth, a statement of his life's unchanging pattern. "That doesn't mean you always have to be," Martha insisted. She looked around the sparse cabin, noting the single bunk, the few utensils. "I can sleep by the fire. I can make myself useful." She was not asking for permission. She was stating her intention. Her tall frame seemed to fill the small space, not with aggression, but with an unyielding presence. The hermit looked from her determined face to the door, then back to her. He seemed to search for words, for a way to make her understand. He was not unkind, merely unused to such an invasion of his carefully constructed solitude. He had built his life around being alone, and this tall woman, with her quiet strength and seeing eyes, was upsetting the very foundation of it. But Martha remained, unwavering, a gentle rock against his silent protests. She had seen his loneliness, and she could not unsee it. The hermit stood by the door, a silent sentinel, watching Martha as she settled herself. He didn't invite her, didn't offer a place, but he also didn't physically remove her. It was a standoff of wills, Martha's quiet resolve against his ingrained solitude. She simply unrolled a blanket by the hearth, laying out her few possessions with a calm competence that defied his unspoken resistance. The first few days were a study in awkward silences. The hermit continued his routine, rising before dawn, tending to his tasks and carving. Martha, true to her word, found her own rhythm. She swept the cabin floor, cooked simple meals over the fire, and fetched water from the nearby spring. She worked without asking for permission, simply doing what needed to be done. He would occasionally watch her, his gaze curious but still guarded, like a wild creature observing a new, harmless presence. Meals were the most challenging. They would sit at the small table, the wooden heart Martha had brought resting between them, a silent witness. The only sounds would be the clinking of spoons against tin plates and the crackle of the fire. Martha tried a few times to make conversation, asking about the wood or the mountains, but the hermit's replies were always brief, sometimes just a nod or a shake of his head. He was not rude, just unpracticed in the art of talk. Yet, slowly, a different kind of communication began to grow. Martha noticed how his eyes would follow her movements, not with suspicion, but with a growing awareness. He started leaving freshly chopped firewood closer to the door, a silent acknowledgement of her efforts. One morning, she woke to find a small, smooth stone placed carefully beside her blanket, a mountain flower resting on top. A silent offering, perhaps. She, in turn, began to understand his unspoken language. The way his shoulders tensed when a storm was brewing, the gentle hum he made when a carving was going well, the faint scent of pine that always clung to him. She learned to read the subtle shifts in his posture, the slight movements of his eyes. There was a quiet respect that began to form, like two old trees growing side by side, their roots intertwining beneath the earth. They were still two separate beings, but the sharp edges of his isolation were beginning to soften, just a little, under the steady warmth of her presence. It was a silent understanding, built not on words, but on shared space and unspoken kindness. One afternoon, as Martha swept the cabin, she paused near the hermit's workbench. He was absorbed in his carving, his brow furrowed in concentration. On a small stool nearby, a half-finished heart lay, its rough edges waiting for his skilled touch. Martha found herself watching his hands, mesmerized by their careful movements. She picked up a discarded piece of wood, a small, oddly shaped offcut, and ran her thumb over its grain. Without looking up, the hermit extended a small, sharp knife towards her, its handle smooth from years of use. It was a silent invitation, a gesture that spoke more than any words. Martha hesitated for a moment, then took the knife. Its weight felt good in her hand. She sat on the stool, mirroring his posture, and awkwardly tried to scrape a sliver from the wood. It was harder than it looked. The wood resisted, and the knife slipped. The hermit stopped his work. He reached over, his large, calloused hand gently guiding hers. "Like this," he rumbled, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. He showed her how to hold the knife, how to let the blade follow the grain, not fight against it. He showed her the trick of finding the wood's natural path. From that day on, the carving bench became a shared space. He would set aside small pieces of wood for her, often with interesting knots or patterns. He didn't lecture, but he demonstrated slowly and patiently. He taught her how to sharpen a chisel until it could shave a whisper of wood, how to smooth a surface until it felt like silk. He showed her how to draw the heart shape, the perfect curve that had become his signature. As they worked side by side, the silence between them began to fill with a new kind of sound, the soft scrape of blades, the rustle of wood shavings, the occasional quiet sigh. Sometimes he would tell her about the trees the wood came from, a gnarled old cedar that had stood for 100 years, a young pine that had grown straight and tall. He spoke of the mountain's moods, how the wood felt different after a rain or under a full moon. These were not just lessons in carving. They were glimpses into his soul, the stories woven into his craft, revealing the deep connection he felt to the natural world. Martha listened, absorbing his quiet wisdom, her own hands slowly learning the language of wood. As the hermit opened his world of wood and mountain lore to Martha, she, in turn, began to introduce him to a different kind of language, the language of human connection. It wasn't loud or demanding, but gentle, like the slow melting of mountain snow in spring. She started with small things. When he handed her a tool, her fingers would brush his, a fleeting contact that he at first seemed to ignore. If he coughed, she would offer him a cup of warm tea, her hand lightly touching his arm as she passed it. These were simple gestures, born of care and common decency, but for a man who had lived without such contact for decades, they were revolutionary. His first reactions were subtle, a slight stiffening of his muscles, a quick withdrawal of his hand. But Martha was patient. She didn't press, didn't make a fuss. She just kept offering these small, quiet connections. Slowly, very slowly, his body began to relax. The stiffening became less noticeable, the withdrawal less abrupt. Sometimes his fingers would linger for a fraction of a second longer when their hands met over a piece of wood. One chilly evening, as a storm raged outside, rattling the cabin windows, Martha noticed the hermit shiver. Without a word, She found an old, thick blanket and draped it over his shoulders as he sat by the fire. She didn't pat him or squeeze his arm, just let the warmth of the blanket settle around him. He paused his carving, a surprised look on his face, and then, slowly, pulled the blanket tighter. It was a small act, but it held a warmth beyond the wool itself. She also introduced him to the comfort of shared presence without the need for words. Sometimes she would simply sit near him as he carved, not working, just being there. She might hum a soft tune or quietly mend a tear in her clothes. This shared quiet was different from his old solitude. It was a quiet that held the promise of warmth, not the chill of emptiness. She was teaching him that touch wasn't just about feeling wood or stone. It was about feeling another person's care, a silent balm for his long-held emotional barriers. Slowly, the walls around his heart, built over years of isolation, began to show tiny cracks, letting in slivers of a new kind of light. The mountain sun streamed through the cabin window, illuminating dancing dust motes and the fine, golden curls of wood shavings on the floor. At the workbench, the Hermit and Martha sat side by side, their elbows almost touching. In front of them, 2 blocks of cedar waited. He had given her a slightly smaller piece, one with a particularly pleasing grain. His hands, once strangers to any but his own touch and the feel of raw wood, now moved with a new awareness. He held his chisel, his gaze fixed on the curve he was shaping, but his motions were subtly softer, less isolated. Martha, beside him, was carefully smoothing the surface of her own nascent heart. Her hands, once clumsy with the tools, now held them with growing confidence, guided by his earlier lessons and her own careful practice. The quiet was still present, but it was no longer heavy or empty. It was a comfortable quiet, filled with the rhythmic scrape of steel against wood, the soft sigh of breath, and the occasional rustle of cloth as one of them shifted. Their movements had begun to mirror each other. When he leaned in to inspect a delicate curve, she would often do the same. When his hand paused to turn the wood, her hand, too, would instinctively pause. Sometimes, without a word, he would reach for a different tool from the rack and place it in her hand, knowing exactly what she needed before she realized it herself. Sometimes, when she struggled with a stubborn knot, he would gently lay his own hand over hers, not to take over, but to lend his strength, his steady warmth, for just a moment. Her hand would no longer stiffen. Instead, a shared understanding would pass between them, unspoken but deeply felt. The air in the cabin, once so cold with his loneliness, now held a faint, lingering warmth. It wasn't just the fire, it was the quiet hum of 2 souls, once so separate, now finding a shared rhythm. They were not merely carving wood. They were carving out a new space for each other in the world, one silent stroke at a time. The wooden hearts they shaped, each one a testament to remembrance, were now also becoming symbols of a quiet, unexpected connection, a testament to what 2 people could build together, even in silence. Their hands, once only familiar with their own solitary tasks, now moved as if guided by a single, gentle pulse. The changes in the Hermit and his cabin were not sudden, like a spring flood, but gradual, like the softening of the earth after a long winter. The cabin, once a place of stark necessity, began to bloom with small, homey touches. Martha had added a colorful, hand-stitched quilt to the Hermit's bunk, replacing the plain, rough blanket. Wildflowers, gathered from the mountain meadows, now sat in a tin cup on the table, their bright colors a cheerful contrast to the muted wood tones. The air, too, felt different. It carried the scent of Martha's simple cooking, of freshly baked bread and simmering stew, mixed with the familiar pine and wood smoke. And the Hermit himself? His changes were even more profound, though no less subtle. The deep lines around his eyes, once etched by solitary observation, now seemed to soften, hinting at a hidden warmth. His shoulders, once habitually hunched, now carried less of a burden. He still spoke little, but his silence was no longer a wall. It was more like a comfortable, shared space where words were not always needed. He began to smile, a rare and gentle curving of his lips that Martha cherished. It was not a boisterous laugh, but a quiet acknowledgement, a flicker of joy that reached his eyes. Sometimes, when Martha would hum a tune while mending, he would stop his carving for a moment, listening, a faint, almost imperceptible sway in his body. He even started to hum along, a low, rumbling sound that was more like the mountain itself finding its voice. His gaze, once distant and guarded, now held a newfound gentleness when it rested on Martha. He would often watch her as she went about her tasks, a quiet contentment settling over his features. He no longer pulled his hand away when their fingers brushed. Instead, he might even let his hand rest for a moment, a silent comfort. The world, for the hermit, had expanded beyond the boundaries of his own solitude. He was still the man of the mountains, connected to the earth and the wood, but he was also now connected to another human heart, a connection that had chased the chill from his cabin and, more importantly, from his soul. The starkness of his life had given way to a quiet, enduring warmth. One evening, as the last rays of sun dipped below the mountain peaks, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, the hermit sat by the hearth. Martha was humming softly as she tidied the small table. He held a newly finished heart in his hands, its surface polished to a soft glow, ready for its purpose. But this time, his gaze wasn't just on the wood. It was on Martha, moving gracefully in the firelight. He thought back to the day she arrived, a tall, determined shadow at his door. He remembered the cold, empty echo of his cabin before she had come, a space filled only with the sounds of his own quiet work and the wind outside. He had been content, he told himself, but now he knew it was a lonely contentment. He had been like a tree, strong and rooted, but standing alone in a vast forest, never feeling the brush of another leaf. He looked down at the heart in his hands. It was perfect as always, but something was different. The very act of carving it now felt different. It was no longer just about the wood or the skill or the memory it would mark. It was about the hands that had learned beside him, the quiet presence that had filled his silent hours. It was about the small, gentle touches that had warmed his skin and, more importantly, his spirit. A profound realization washed over him, soft and quiet, like a fresh snowfall. Martha hadn't just brought warmth to his cabin. She had brought warmth to him. She had seen his loneliness, a loneliness he had lived with for so long he no longer saw it himself, and she had stayed. She had broken through years of solitude, not with force, but with patience, kindness, and the simple gift of her presence. He remembered her hand over his as they carved, the warmth of her fingers, the unspoken understanding. He remembered the blanket she had draped over him, the way her humming filled the quiet. He had been lost in his own world, a world of wood and mountains, but she had shown him there was another world, a world of human connection, and it was not something to fear. It was a moment of quiet redemption, a silent acknowledgement that his life, once a solitary journey, was now shared, and in that sharing, it was infinitely richer. He looked at Martha, a faint, soft smile touching his lips, a smile that held all the gratitude his words could not express. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The seasons cycled through the mountains, but inside the small cabin, a constant warmth now glowed. One crisp autumn morning, as the leaves outside turned brilliant shades of red and gold, the hermit and Martha sat at their workbench. Between them lay a wooden heart, unlike any the hermit had carved before. This heart was a little larger, its curves a bit softer, almost as if the wood itself had learned to breathe. It was made from a piece of mountain maple, its grains swirling in gentle patterns. But what made it truly special was that they had carved it together. His strong, experienced hands had done the initial shaping, guiding the rough block. Then, Martha's increasingly skilled fingers had taken over, smoothing the surfaces, refining the edges, bringing out the maple's subtle warmth. As they both put the finishing polish on it, their hands brushed a familiar, comforting contact that now felt entirely natural. The hermit looked at the heart, then at Martha, his eyes holding a depth of emotion that had once been carefully hidden. He reached out, not for a tool, but for her hand, and gently clasped it. His touch was firm, warm, and no longer hesitant. "It is good," he rumbled, his voice still low, but now carrying a resonance of quiet joy. "For all that is lost, and all that is found." Martha's eyes, clear and bright, met his. She understood. This heart, meant for a grave, now stood for so much more. It represented her journey to his door, her stubborn refusal to leave, and his gradual, silent acceptance. It symbolized the wood he had taught her to shape, and the human touch she had taught him to receive. It was a testament to the quiet redemption found in shared space, in unspoken understanding, and in the enduring power of two lonely souls finding solace in each other. The heart was a beautiful, solid piece of wood, but within its smooth curves lay the story of two lives, now entwined, carved together by fate and a gentle, persistent love. It would stand not just as a marker of an ending, but as a silent, strong symbol of a new beginning.